if you've ever wondered how to shoot in manual mode and take control of your camera, well, you're in for a treat. Now, I'm an amateur photographer, just like you, stumbling through the learning process, but I've picked up a few tricks along the way that I think you're gonna find useful. And trust me, I know it can be intimidating to get off that cozy auto setting, but stick with me and I'll show you how to take control of your camera and unleash your inner creative genius. And at the end of this video, I've got a bonus point that is going to explain how to juggle all of these different settings when you've got to work really quickly. All right, let's kick things off with the basics. When you're shooting in manual, you're juggling three main settings: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Think of them as the three musketeers of photography. They all work together to create the perfect exposure. And so let's break them down step by step so that we can switch to manual mode today. First up, let's talk about aperture. The little hole at the front of your lens that lets light in, that's your aperture. It's like the pupil of your eye. You can make it bigger or smaller to control how much light is hitting your camera sensor. And now here's where it starts to get a little bit confusing. Aperture is measured in what are called f-stops, and the numbers work backwards, which is a little bit weird. A small f number like f1.8 means a wide aperture letting in loads of light. A big f-stop number like f16 means a tiny aperture which lets in much less light. But your aperture isn't just about light. It controls what's called the depth of field. That's photography nerd speak for how much of your image is actually in focus. With a wide aperture or small f number, you're going to get a shallow depth of field. This is great for portraits where you want your subject to look sharp and you want your background to be all blurry and dreamy. A small aperture or a big f number keeps more of your scene in focus. This is perfect for what I do, which is landscape photography, where you want the whole image to be sharp from front to back. And when I'm working in manual mode, I like to think of the aperture as being the depth control of my photography. Okay, so now that we've got the aperture down, let's move on to the next piece of the puzzle. So have you ever wondered how one might go about freezing a picture of a hummingbird's wings that are moving crazy fast, or getting those cool light trails in photography where you've got cars racing past you? That's where shutter speed comes in. Okay, so shutter speed is typically a little bit easier to wrap your head around. It's simply how long your camera speed shutter stays open to let light in to hit that sensor. The longer the shutter is open, the more light that gets in and the brighter your image is going to be. Shutter speed is measured in seconds or fractions of a second. So 1/1000 means that the shutter is open for 1/1000th of a second. That's super fast. On the flip side, 1 with a quotation mark means 1 full second. If you want to freeze a hummingbird's wings mid-flap, you need a super fast shutter speed, like 1/4000th of a second. If you want to create those cool light trails from a car headlights or tail lights, then go for a slow shutter speed of several seconds. And I like to think of shutter speed as the movement control of my camera. Fast shutter speeds freeze action, slow shutter speeds show motion. It's like having a tiny time machine right in your hands. All right, so we've mastered aperture, we've mastered shutter speed, but what if you're shooting in a dimly lit room and you still just, with all these tools, can't get a bright enough exposure? You can't see what the heck's going on in your images. That's where our next setting, ISO, comes to the rescue. So last but not least, we've got ISO. This is the one that used to confuse me the most. But here is how I now think about it. ISO is like a volume knob for your camera's sensitivity to light. So a low ISO, like 100 or 200, means that your camera isn't very sensitive to light. This is great for bright, sunny days or when there's plenty of light to go around. A high ISO, like 3200, 6400 or higher, makes your camera super sensitive to light, which is perfect for low light conditions. But here's the catch, and there's always a catch, right? The higher you crank that ISO, the more noise or graininess you're going to see in your images. It's like turning up the volume on an old radio. At some point, you're going to start to hear static. So when I'm doing my landscape photography, I try to keep my ISO as low as possible for the cleanest images. But sometimes, if you're shooting in a dimly lit room or you're trying to capture the night sky, you've got to bump it up. It's all about finding that sweet spot between a bright enough image or exposure and acceptable image quality. And I like to think of ISO as the balance control, and we're going to cover why in the next section. So now you're thinking, great, I understand all these settings, Will. Fantastic, but how the heck do I use them together? Well, don't worry, I've got you covered. Let's see how these three amigos work as a team to create the perfect exposure. So you can think of working with aperture, shutter speed, and ISO like a game of photography Jenga. You're trying to build the perfect exposure by stacking and switching and changing these three elements. If you change one of them, you might have to adjust the others to keep everything balanced. For example, let's say you're shooting a portrait and you want that nice blurry background. So you're going to set your aperture or your depth control wide open at f1.8. But oh no, your image is now too bright. What are you going to do? Well, you could increase your shutter speed to let in less light, or you could lower your ISO or the balance control to make your sensor less sensitive. Similarly, let's say that you want to take a picture of a fast-moving race car that shoots past you. So you know that you want to have a fast shutter speed or movement control of, let's say, 1/4000th of a second to get a sharp subject, but this dramatically limits the light that you have available. So this time you could increase your ISO or your balance control to balance out the three elements of exposure and create that perfect image. It's all about give and then take. You want a fast shutter speed to freeze the action, then you might need to open up your aperture or bump up your ISO to compensate. When you're in manual mode, it's like you're doing this photography dance, and with practice, you're going to learn to lead like a pro. Now, how do you know if your exposure, when you're adjusting all these settings, is spot on, or if your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO need changing? That's where your camera's light meter comes in real handy. It's like having a little exposure expert built right into your camera. Now, most cameras are going to show a light meter in a scale on the viewfinder or on the LCD screen. It usually goes from -3 stops to +3 stops with a 0 in the middle. And the goal is to get the little indicator on the scale to 0 for a quote-unquote correct exposure. If your indicator is on the plus side, your image is overexposed or it's too bright. If it's on the minus side, it's underexposed or it's too dark. And so you can adjust your aperture, shutter speed, or ISO to move that indicator one way or another until it hits 0. But here is the secret. Sometimes correct isn't actually what you want. Maybe you're going for a dark, moody look, or you want a bright, airy feel. Don't be afraid to intentionally over or underexpose your image if that's what you want from your photography. Remember, you are the artist here. Your camera doesn't know what the heck it's taking a picture of, it's just gauging the light that's hitting the sensor. You are the artist. All right, okay, right. We've covered a lot of ground here, and your head might be starting to spin a bit. But don't worry, like any good skill, this one just needs a little bit of practice. So let's talk about how to get comfortable with all these new tricks. Firstly, start by picking just one setting to adjust manually while leaving the others on auto. So let me explain. Maybe begin with aperture priority mode, usually marked on your camera as an A or an AV on the mode dial on top. This lets you control the aperture or your depth control manually while your camera handles shutter speed. Once you're comfortable with that, why not try shutter priority mode or S or TV on the dial on the top of your camera to play with motion effects. Then, when you're ready, take the plunge, go into full manual mode. And don't worry, of course, if your first shots aren't perfect. Mine certainly weren't. They were terrible for a few weeks of trying to get used to all this. But photography is all about experimentation and then learning from those mistakes. I like to think of it as like learning to drive a car. At first, I know I was anyway, all over the place, consciously having to think about gear, clutch, acceleration, all the nuances, all the stuff, the road signs. You're stalling, you're grinding gears, you're annoying everyone else on the road who's having to drive around you. But with practice, driving becomes second nature. And you're going to find yourself, after a couple of months of driving, arriving at work in the morning and you haven't even thought about any of the driving. It's all been done subconsciously. The process is ingrained in your brain. And that's what happens when you switch to manual mode and you practice for a long enough period of time. But maybe manual mode isn't all that it's cracked up to be. Maybe there's one setting that we should leave on auto. All right, as promised, I've got a killer bonus tip for you. And this one is a game changer for any situation where the action is moving way too fast for you to adjust all these settings manually. And the tip is to use auto ISO. Yes, you heard me right. We're going to bring a little bit of automatic back into shooting in manual mode, but we're going to do it in a smart way. Here is how it works. You set your aperture or your depth control. You set your shutter speed or your movement control, and you set these manually based on your creative vision and the action that you're trying to capture. Then, well, you let the camera automatically adjust the ISO so that you get the right exposure. It's like having a friendly little helper inside your camera that works at lightning speed, much faster than you could possibly ever be twisting and turning dials or pressing buttons, and they're just helping you out. You're still in control of the most important creative aspects of the photography that you're doing, the depth of field, the motion that you're capturing, of course your composition as well, but you're letting the camera handle the fine tuning of exposure so that everything pulls together nicely. Almost all modern cameras have an auto ISO setting, so look for it in your camera's settings menu, set a minimum value, set a maximum value, and you're good to go. And this technique is incredibly useful for anyone who's shooting fast, wildlife photography, sports photography, or any situation where the light is changing quickly and you need to react in that moment. It's not cheating, it's working smarter, not harder. And most of the pros that I know who work in fast-paced environments all use auto ISO, and so you should probably use it as well. And if you want to take sharp photos with any camera or any lens, click the video that's on the screen right now.